Hi, I'm Connie from the Scarborough Public Library. We're going to keep reading No Talking by Andrew Clements, published by Simon and Schuster. We are reading about a fifth grade in New Jersey where the kids are really talkative and loud and really insulting with one another, terribly insulting. And they decide to try to have a contest and see if they can not talk, girls against the boys, no talking, for 2 days, for 48 hours. Now we're going to get to meet the principal and some of the teachers. I can imagine what the teachers will be thinking. We're on Chapter 7, the Unshushables. Since Dave and Lindsay had been almost shouting at each other in the middle of the cafeteria, you might think that a lot of other fifth graders in the room would have tuned in and paid attention to the conversation. You might think that a lot of kids in the lunchroom already knew about the contest, but if you thought that, you'd be wrong, and you'd be wrong because you don't understand just how loud, how incredibly noisy it was in the cafeteria during fifth grade lunch. And not just on this one day. It was noisy during fifth grade lunch every single day. And it wasn't noisy only at lunch. Anywhere a bunch of these fifth graders got together, the talking got out of hand. That's why it's time to tell you a little more about this particular set of fifth grade kids. Because there's more to tell. There's always more. A school system really is a little like the Army. Remember about how kindergarten is sort of like basic training camp? Because kindergarten was where Dave and the other new recruits first learned the rules. They learned when to sit and when to stand, when to talk and when to laugh, when to walk, when to run, when to eat and nap and play and sing and draw and everything else. Because every system needs rules. No rules, no system. Most of the rules made perfect sense to Dave and the new recruits, especially rules like this. No fighting, no bullying, no shoving, no spitting, no biting, no stealing, no vandalism, no cutting in line, no snowball throwing, and so on. For most kids, the really serious rules like that weren't hard at all. Those were the easy ones. The toughest rules were ones like no running in the halls, hard. No disorderly behavior on the buses, also hard. No candy or chewing gum, very hard. But nowhere in the 44-page Laketon Elementary School handbook did it actually say, no whispering, chatting, talking, calling out, yelling, or shouting in classrooms, in the hallways, in the auditorium, or in the lunchroom. True, there was a rule about paying attention in class, and there was a rule about being respectful. And there was a rule about being courteous at all times. And Dave and his classmates obeyed those rules, or at least they thought they did. It's just that they all seemed to think they could talk and be courteous at the same time. And they all seemed to think they could talk and pay attention at the same time. Because none of these kids really meant to be disrespectful or disobedient or discourteous, but none of them wanted to stop talking, ever. In fact, this group of kids had been given a nickname by the teachers at Laketon Elementary School, and the name had stuck with them ever since they'd been in first grade together. They were the Unshushables. If Laketon Elementary School had really been like the Army, then sometime, probably during the second grade, Dave and Lindsay and all the other recruits would have lined up out on the playground on a cold, rainy morning, and a gruff man with short hair and shiny shoes would have walked up and down in front of them, shouting right into their faces, and he would have shouted something like this. You drive me crazy. You call yourself students. You're a miserable mob. You're loud, undisciplined. I will not tolerate your noise. When you walk in my hallways, you do not shout. You do not wave and yell and hoot when you see your friends. At an assembly in my school, you do not whisper and giggle and point and wave and laugh at your own silly jokes. And when you come to my lunchroom, it is not a free-for-all festival of flap jaws, jibber-jabber. Lunch is a time to sit and be quiet and eat. I'm going to teach you little motor-mouth monsters proper school manners if it's the last thing I do. Do I make myself clear? Yes, sir. Quieter. Yes, sir. But of course, Laketon Elementary School wasn't the Army. However, with Mrs. Abigail Hyatt in charge, sometimes it felt that way. She was a tall woman with a long face, curly gray hair, and bright blue eyes, and she had been the principal at Laketon Elementary School for the past 13 years. She gave careful orders, set precise goals, and she demanded results from her teachers, from her office staff, from her custodians, from her cafeteria workers, and from her students and their parents too. Her school never went over budget, never missed its academic targets, and the place never felt loose or sloppy or disorderly. Under Mrs. Hyatt's watchful eye, group after group of children had wandered into Laketon Elementary School as aimless little kindergarteners and marched out 6 years later as perfectly disciplined young students. Under Mrs. Hyatt's leadership, the place ran like clockwork. And then the Unshushables came along. In all her years as principals, she had never known a group of kids like this. And for the past 5 years, Mrs. Hyatt had been trying to make these kids obey the simplest school rule of all: no talking except when it's allowed. Year after year, memos had been sent home to the parents of Dave and his classmates about too much shouting on the school buses. Year after year, Dave's grade had been told how to behave before every assembly. Year after year, all the teachers had stood out in the hallways to try to keep the noise down before and after school, and especially at lunchtime. This group had been given a separate lunch period for the past 3 years in a row: third grade lunch, fourth grade lunch, and this year, fifth grade lunch. Mrs. Hyatt had made this decision. She didn't want the noisy behavior of this group to infect the other children at her school, because year after year, the Unshushables lived up to their nickname. To be honest, a few of this year's fifth grade teachers had already given up. They didn't have any real hope of changing these kids. They were just trying to cope because it was already November. So in 6 short months, the Unshushables would be gone forever, moved along to middle school, and next year, Laketon Elementary School would be quieter, much quieter. But Mrs. Hyatt hadn't given up, not by a long shot. She still had over half a year with these kids, and she intended to use that time. Every day the principal stalked the fifth grade hall. "You there, stop talking." At every assembly she glared, "And I don't want to hear even a whisper from our fifth graders, is that clear?" At every fifth grade lunch she walked around the cafeteria with a big red plastic bullhorn. And when the noise became unbearable, she pulled the trigger and shouted, "Students, you are talking too loud." Mrs. Hyatt felt sure that this constant reminding had to be having an effect on these kids. How could it not? After all, these were good kids, right? They had to be making progress, didn't they? She knew she was being very stern with them, but it was for their own good. And Mrs. Hyatt felt sure that sooner or later, these kids would grow up a little and quiet down a lot. And there's Mrs. Hyatt with her red plastic bullhorn. And now it's time to tell what happened in the middle of the second Tuesday in November during Dave Packard's final year at Laketon Elementary School. It was 2 minutes before fifth grade lunch, and the principal was ready, just like always. Mrs. Hyatt had checked to be sure that the other teacher who had fifth grade lunch duty wasn't out sick or at a meeting, because it wasn't good to try to manage fifth grade lunch all by yourself. And just like that, she had ordered Mr. Lipton, the custodian, to stay in the cafeteria today until 12:40, because with this group, the more grown-ups around, the better. And Mrs. Hyatt had double-checked the batteries in her red plastic bullhorn, because it wasn't good to have a dead bullhorn during fifth grade lunch. Then the bell rang, and as classroom doors opened along the fifth grade hall, Mrs. Hyatt could hear them coming, all of them, already calling to each other as locker doors clanged shut and banged shut, already talking a mile a minute, already laughing and whooping and shouting, streaming down the hall towards the cafeteria, an unshushable wave of energy and excitement and noise, so much noise. Mrs. Hyatt took her position at the center of the cafeteria and braced herself. She was ready for today's lunchroom battle, ready to change chaos into order, ready for anything these kids could dish out. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. Chapter 8, Science Fiction. It was 4 minutes into 5th grade lunch period, and Mrs. Hyatt was pretty sure that any second now her alarm clock was going to start making that awful sound. Beep, 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 beep. Because the principal was almost certain that she was still at home in her own comfy bed dreaming away. She had to be dreaming, but no. She looked at her watch and it showed the same time as the loud clock above the stage in the school cafeteria, 12:04. On any other day, Mrs. Hyatt would have already used her bullhorn at least once, because when half the 5th graders were standing in the food line and the other half were in the milk line or rushing toward their seats, there was always a terrific burst of yelling and calling out and wild chatter, sort of like feeding time at the zoo. Excuse me. Not today. There was no talking at all. Not one word. Not one word. Over 125 children milling around the lunchroom and not a peep from any of them. Today the principal could hear the clattering of the worn-out motor in the milk cooler, and she could see the kitchen workers talking softly to each other, and she could hear the children's feet on the floor, shuffling along through the lines. The quiet almost frightened her. Mrs. Hyatt felt like she was in a scene from a creepy science fiction movie. She actually liked a good scary movie now and then, but she did not like the ideas in her mind at this moment because it seemed like aliens had possessed these 5th graders and zapped their brains. Or maybe some strange creatures had come and nipped off all their tongues, nothing left but little stubs that couldn't make a sound. The principal shivered. Then she noticed a girl staring at her. Mrs. Hyatt realized she must have had a strange look on her face. As the girl sat down with her lunch tray, Mrs. Hyatt forced herself to smile and said, "Hi there, Sheila. How are you today?" Her voice almost echoed in the quiet lunchroom. Every boy in the milk line turned and stared at Sheila. The girls turned and looked too. Sheila gulped, gave the principal a nervous smile, and speaking softly and slowly, she said, "Fine, thank you." Mrs. Hyatt turned toward the milk line, and all the kids looked away silently. And again, the principal felt like she was in the middle of a science fiction movie. It suddenly seemed silly to be standing there in a silent room with her huge red plastic bullhorn. So Mrs. Hyatt walked over to the playground door where Mrs. Escobar was standing. She tried to look as casual as possible, tried to act like it was perfectly normal for the lunchroom to be stone silent except for the clattering of plates and the squeaking of sneakers on the waxed floor. The principal set the bullhorn on the floor by the wall and whispered to Mrs. Escobar, what in the world is going on here?" Mrs. Escobar whispered back, "I have no idea, but it's something weird, that's for sure." Mrs. Hyatt did not like this feeling that something strange, something new was happening, because this new activity was happening at her school and no one had asked her permission. The new activity was unauthorized. Mrs. Hyatt didn't simply like being in charge of her own school. She felt like she needed to be in charge, and that's why she felt like she had to say something, do something, to break the spell. So she stepped away from the wall, and in a loud voice she said, "Good afternoon, 5th graders. Are you enjoying your lunchtime today?" All the kids looked at each other. The whole room seemed to take a deep breath, and then almost everyone said, "Yes, Mrs. Hyatt," and then silence again. And after an awkward few seconds, the principal said, "It's so quiet in here today. I'm very impressed with your good behavior." Some kids smiled, some nodded, but no one said a word. Mrs. Hyatt said, "Is there some special reason why no one's talking today?" The whole room went still. Even the chewing stopped. No hands went up. No one answered her question. But Mrs. Hyatt was a keen observer, and in that sudden stillness, she noticed something. Right after she asked her question, it seemed like almost every boy looked at Dave Packer, who was standing beside the milk cooler, and it seemed like almost every girl took a quick look at Lindsay Burgess, who was just sitting down at a table. And the principal thought, that's odd. But the whole situation was odd, very odd, and now it seemed like the room was stuck in a complete calm, as if all the kids had even stopped breathing. Everyone was waiting to see what she was going to do next. After a few more seconds of suspense, Mrs. Hyatt cleared her throat and said, "Well, students, please enjoy the rest of your lunchtime." And the cafeteria came back to life silently. Chapter 9, The Right Word. As Dave sat down at a lunch table with his friends, he couldn't get the grin off his face. He was having so much fun he could hardly chew his first bite of grilled cheese. And he didn't like chewing right now because chewing made noise, and when he munched, he couldn't hear the silence. The silence. Dave thought the silence was amazing. And watching Mrs. Hyatt try to figure out what was going on, that was amazing too. It was like they had trapped her in a force field, and she couldn't get out of it because the silence filled the cafeteria. Dave looked around, and he saw the same amazement on the faces of other kids. They were all thinking about the same thing together. Then suddenly, "Hey, give it back!" There was a gasp as every boy and girl in the room sucked in a breath, and all heads turned to see where the words had come from. And there, at the ice cream freezer, Ed Kesey had one hand over his mouth while his other hand reached for a cherry popsicle that Brian Del Greco had grabbed. Dave swung around and looked at Lindsay. Lindsay knew a lot of kids were watching her, but she pretended not to notice. She slowly reached into her back pocket, slowly pulled out a pen and a small red notebook, slowly opened the cover, and slowly made 4 little marks on the first page. And as she flipped the notebook shut, Lindsay looked right at Dave and gave him a big smile. Just like that, and the girls were ahead by 4 points. But Dave wasn't worried. The contest had barely begun. There were 2 whole days to go. Dave was absolutely sure that the next 48 hours were going to be very interesting. And he thought, is that the right word? How about fascinating? No, more like exciting. Yeah, exciting. Then Dave happened to glance at Mrs. Hyatt, and he could tell from the look on the principal's face that she had been watching everything. The way Ed had shouted those words and then covered his mouth, the way all the other kids had reacted, the way Lindsay had marked her notebook. And at that exact moment, the principal turned and locked eyes with Dave. She stared right at him with her eyebrows all bunched up in a puzzled knot. Dave quickly looked down at his lunch tray, and as he did, a new word popped into his mind. And he was pretty sure this one was also going to be a good word to describe the next few days. Dangerous. Chapter 10, Recess. Mrs. Marlowe was the 5th grade science teacher, and it was her day for outdoor recess duty. As she was gulping down a quick lunch in the teacher's room, Mr. Lipton, the custodian, stuck his head in the door and said, "Anybody want to see a miracle? Go check out the cafeteria. The 5th graders aren't talking today. Not even whispering. It's like a funeral in there." But Mrs. Marlowe didn't have a moment to spare. She finished her lunch, grabbed her coat, and hurried outside to the playground through the gym. Even without the heads up from the custodian, it wouldn't have taken her long to figure out that something was different at outside recess today. Every teacher knows the sound of a normal, happy playground at lunchtime. Kids talking and yelling and chasing and all the arguments about who's it, who's in, who's out, who ran faster. Not today. Mrs. Marlowe could tell that a whole layer of spoken sound was missing, gone, absent, except not completely, because the kids did make some slip-ups during their first wordless recess. Allie Bedford got caught whispering to Lena Henderson by the swing set, and when a group of boys stood and shook their fingers at her, she held up 8 fingers to show how many illegal words she had said. Christina Farley didn't have to confess because half the kids in the playground heard exactly what she said loud and clear. She stomped her feet, stuck out her tongue at Rachel Morgan, and then shouted, "You're a terrible friend, and you lie, and you're selfish, and I don't care how many words this is, and you're mean too," which was 23 words. Christina's goof, plus the 8 words Allie whispered, meant that Dave got to record 31 points against the girls on his official score sheet, which wasn't as fancy as Lindsay's red notebook, just a couple of folded index cards stuffed in his pocket. But the boys weren't perfect either. Scott Vickers booted a kickball down the 3rd base line, and when 2 boys made the foul ball motion, he yelled, "Foul, are you crazy? No way, that ball was fair." And Scott would have kept on yelling, but Bill Harkness tackled him and clamped a hand over his mouth, which caught Scott bit, but not hard enough to make Bill yell any words. That incident cost the boys 10 points. And then there was the first case of trickery. Katie Edison snuck up behind Jeremy Stevens, who was standing by the sliding board, tapped him on the shoulder, and when he turned his head, she gave him a big, noisy kiss on the cheek. Jeremy howled and wiped his face and flew into a fit of cootieitis. Ooh, yuck, why did you do that? That was so gross. Yuck, help me get this stuff off my face. Which was 20 more points for the girls. Plus, Katie actually enjoyed her sneak attack. She'd had a top secret crush on Jeremy for 2 months. Even though there were only a few word blasts, it certainly wasn't quiet out there, and it got noisier and noisier as the end of recess got closer. That's because everyone began to realize that this was not a contest to see who could be silent. It was just about not talking. Sounds were allowed as long as they weren't words. Dave was near the door of the gym and began whistling. He instantly was joined by 4 of the boys. They whistled every song they could think of. Row, row, row your boat, Now I Know My ABCs, London Bridge is Falling Down, Barney's marching song, the Star Wars theme song, Old MacDonald Had a Farm, I've Been Working on the Railroad, Rubber Ducky, on and on. The whistling was mostly off key, but it was a grand performance anyway, with lots of clapping and hooting between tunes. Somewhere near the middle of the whistling contest, 6 or 7 girls began screaming. These were not the kind of screams that make grown-ups come running. They were just an ugly assortment of squeals and yelps and shrieks that everyone else found very annoying. Spaced out around the edge of the playground, the girls bounced their high-pitched sounds around like a beach ball at a baseball stadium. Yow, wee, woo, yee. They made lots of noise, but they weren't talking. Some other girls were jumping double dutch, and since they couldn't chant the rhymes, the kids who weren't jumping or turning the ropes clapped out the rhythm of the words with their hands. The quietest activity involved 4 girls who had a printed folder that showed how to use American Sign Language. They sat in a circle on the ground and they practiced hand signals. And to round out the soundscape, Bradley Lang and Tyler Rennett were cruising around the playground, bothering as many girls as possible by making all sorts of mouth sounds. Clicks, pops, roars, quacks, barks, burps, and especially those loud bathroom noises created by putting the palms of both hands over your mouth, puffing up the cheeks, and blooping out a blast of air. Mrs. Marlowe could see there was plenty of activity, but those high-pitched playground voices, all that buzz and chatter and calling out, all that was definitely missing. There was no mistaking it. These kids were not talking, which would have been unusual for any bunch of students, but for this group of kids, the custodian had called it right. It was practically a miracle. But why? There had to be a reason they were all acting this way. And as a science-minded person, Mrs. Marlowe was curious. So as she stood there thinking, Mrs. Marlowe began to adjust her afternoon lesson plan, because in about 10 minutes, 26 of the 5th graders would be sitting in her room, ready for science class. And there was nothing Mrs. Marlowe liked better than a good experiment. Chapter 11, Questions and Answers. In all her years of teaching, 17 in total, Mrs. Marlowe had never walked into a quieter classroom full of students. It was a new experience for her. It was also new for these kids. Dave watched Mrs. Marlowe go to the front of the room and pick up her attendance book. The teacher looked at the list of names in the book, looked up and down the rows of the class, looked at the book again, and said, I thought maybe I was in the wrong room. Pretty quiet in here today. Can anyone tell me why? No hands went up. But Mrs. Marlowe was watching for anything that might give her a clue about this unusual behavior. And after her question, she saw a few sly glances between kids, and she noticed some of them trying to hide a smile. She knew what those looks and smiles meant. The kids were keeping a secret. Time for her first experiment. Looking over the class, Mrs. Marlowe settled her eyes on Seth Townsend, smiled and said, So Seth, did you do your science homework last night? With no hesitation, Seth smiled back and said, Yes, I did. Mrs. Marlowe looked at Amy Gibson and said, How about you, Amy? She nodded and said, It was hard. Really, what did you think was hard about it, she asked. Amy scrunched up her face and then she said, Too much math. Her answer got a lot of nods and a few laughs from the other kids, but then it went completely quiet again. Mrs. Marlowe couldn't get over how beautifully these children were behaving. Just yesterday, she had asked one student a question and about 15 others had blurted out answers, and then the whole class began arguing, and they had started a huge free-for-all that didn't end until she banged on her desk with a book. It was always like that with this class, and with the other fifth grade classes too. But not today. No one talked at all, unless she asked a question, which gave Mrs. Marlowe an idea. Please get out your homework sheets. There was a lot of rustling and bustling as the students obeyed. Now, she said, Ellen, look at problem number 1. How did you decide if the given quantities were reasonable? Ellen ruffled through her papers, and the look on her face surprised Mrs. Marlowe. Ellen looked scared. It was one of the standard questions about science problems, a question the whole class was used to, but the girl seemed completely confused. Mrs. Marlowe could see that she'd done the assignment, plus Ellen was one of her best science students. What was she so scared about? After a few moments of what looked like absolute panic, Ellen calmed down. Then very slowly she said, the numbers worked. Mrs. Marlowe waited for the rest of her explanation. It didn't come. Right, she said, and I made estimates, Ellen said. Again, her words came slowly, and then there was another long pause. And, the teacher urged, I used math. Mrs. Marlowe nodded. Of course you used math, but I want to hear about your process, your thinking. Ellen said, I did comparing. Frustrated, Mrs. Marlowe turned to the other side of the room. Dave, tell us the answer you got for problem 1 and explain your process. Dave didn't look scared, but he also took a long time to respond. Too long for Mrs. Marlowe. She said, I'd like your answer today, Mr. Packer. Slowly Dave said, 440. 440 what? Prompted Mrs. Marlowe. Barrels of oil, said Dave slowly. Per, said Mrs. Marlowe. Dave said, per day. Wrong, said Mrs. Marlowe. Look at your work and tell me what you forgot. She was losing her patience. Dave frowned and squinted at his paper. He nodded and then slowly said, the first day. A ripple of giggles swept through the room. Girl giggles. Mrs. Marlowe stopped. Since when did wrong answers become funny? The science teacher thought, are they all pretending to be stupid today? Is that it? Whatever was going on, she didn't like it. It was disruptive, it was slowing down her class, it was annoying, and suddenly Mrs. Marlowe was in no mood for games. She was not going to play along. If these kids wanted quiet, that's what they were going to get. She glared around the room. Pass in your papers. Everyone obeyed without a word. Open to chapter 4 and read. The homework is on the board. The next 34 minutes in the science room passed in complete silence except for the rustle of paper and occasional cough or sniffle. And sitting at her desk, Mrs. Marlowe had to admit that she enjoyed the quiet, enjoyed not having to fight the battle of the mouth every second with these kids. The Unshushables were completely shushed all right. Very weird. But the science teacher wasn't any closer to figuring out why the kids were acting this way. Dave felt something hit his arm and then drop onto his leg. It was a note. He glanced at Mrs. Marlowe, all clear, so he slowly reached down, picked up the note, and unfolded it. You said the first day. Counts as a word. So you said 4 and you cost the boys 1 whole point. Loser. Haha, Lindsay. Dave knew Lindsay was sitting 2 seats back on his left, and he knew she was waiting for him to turn around so she could give him a sickly sweet little smile. So he didn't turn around, but he felt the tops of his ears getting pink, and he began thinking of all the million things he wished he could say to her, all sorts of clever insults like, if brains were money, you'd be broke, or wow, you can count to 4, or I had a pet turtle that, Mr. Packer, bring it here. Dave snapped to attention and looked up to see Mrs. Marlowe staring at him, holding out her hand. Putting on his best innocent face, Dave said, what? The note. Here. As Dave walked up and dropped the note into Mrs. Marlowe's hand, the bell rang. Mrs. Marlowe tucked the paper into her pocket and stood up quickly because when the bell rang, she had to hurry out her door and try to maintain law and order in the hallway between classes. But of course, there was no need for the corridor police today. Not today. Mrs. Marlowe watched all the fifth graders move from room to room, smiling, waving, making faces, nodding at each other. There were a few laughs and whistles, and she heard Tyler Rennett make a loud snort in the general direction of some girls, but there was no talking. She looked across the hall and caught Mrs. Escobar's eye, and they both smiled and then shrugged at each other. And since there wasn't any patrol work to do, Mrs. Marlowe reached into her pocket, pulled out the captured note, and she read it. For a logical person like Mrs. Marlowe, Lindsay's note to Dave was like the Rosetta Stone, a key that helped her begin to understand what she had seen and heard on the playground and then in the classroom. So this whole thing was something about counting words. More than 3 words resulted in a penalty, which explained all their short answers. And it was the boys against the girls. Nothing new about that, not with this group. And they were all trying to keep quiet. Mrs. Marlowe remembered the jinx game from her own school years when 2 people said the same word at the same time and then had to keep quiet. Maybe it was like that. Except this wasn't 2 people. It was more like 125 of the most talkative children on planet Earth. As chunks of the puzzle began to fall into place, Mrs. Marlowe immediately thought, the others are going to love this. She meant the other teachers. But then her scientific curiosity kicked in, and she thought, why spoil the kids' experiment? And I should really let the other teachers figure things out on their own. And of course, my preliminary findings could be wrong. I should certainly gather more data before I present my theory to the scholarly community. And as Mrs. Marlowe chuckled at her own private joke, she said to herself, kids. So, the kids are actually doing this contest, aren't they? What do you think would be the hardest part of the day for you for not talking? Would it be at school, at home, on the bus, on the playground? How do you think your parents would react? And I'm also thinking that now, when we all have iPhones, this book was written a few years ago, before everybody had their phone, we could be texting one another, but not usually texting in school. So what would be hardest for you? Think about that. And I will see you next time. We'll continue reading No Talking by Andrew Clements, published by Simon & Schuster. And I'm Connie from the Scarborough Public Library.